When a grieving widow defies her judgmental town to work alongside a mysterious cowboy on his remote Montana ranch, she discovers that healing broken horses might be the key to mending her own shattered heart. But as their partnership deepens into something more dangerous than friendship, will she have the courage to claim the love that could either redeem her or destroy what little reputation she has left? A lone woman in black stumbled through the tall grass, her dress catching on thorns as she made her way toward a small wooden cross. The Montana wind howled around her like a hungry wolf, but Margaret Hartwell barely noticed the cold biting at her face. She had walked this path every morning for 3 months, ever since the fever took her husband James away from their little cabin outside Willow Creek. The year was 1867, and life in the Montana Territory was hard enough without losing the one person who made it bearable. Margaret dropped to her knees beside the grave, her hands shaking as she placed fresh wildflowers against the weathered wood. The letters carved into the cross were already fading, just like her memories of James's laugh. "I don't know what to do anymore," she whispered to the empty air. "The money's almost gone, and Mrs. Henderson at the store keeps giving me looks like I'm some kind of beggar." The sound of boots crunching on dry leaves made her spin around. A tall man in a worn cowboy hat stood about 10 feet away, his hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but his eyes were kind. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am," he said, his voice gentle as summer rain. "Name's Benjamin Cole. I've been riding past here for weeks, and I couldn't help but notice you visit this spot every day." Margaret wiped her tears quickly, embarrassed that a stranger had caught her crying. "I'm Margaret Hartwell. This is my husband's grave." Benjamin nodded respectfully and removed his hat, revealing brown hair that needed cutting. "I figured as much. Lost my own pa when I was young. Know how it feels to carry that kind of weight." Something in his tone made Margaret look at him more carefully. Most men in town either avoided her completely or stared at her like she was a prize to be won. This cowboy did neither. He just stood there, patient as a mountain, waiting for her to speak. "You're not from around here," she said finally. "No, ma'am. Been working cattle drives mostly, but I'm looking to settle down somewhere. This territory's got good land for a man willing to work hard." He glanced at the grave, then back at her face. "Your husband was lucky to have someone who cares enough to visit him every day." Margaret felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. When was the last time someone had said something kind about her devotion to James instead of criticizing how long she'd been mourning? "He was a good man," she said softly. "Better than this place deserved." Benjamin studied the small town visible in the distance, its buildings looking tiny against the vast sky. Towns can be funny things. Sometimes they bring out the best in people, sometimes the worst. A hawk circled overhead, its cry piercing the afternoon air. Margaret watched it soar freely above the mountains, and for a moment, she envied its ability to go wherever it pleased without worrying about what others might think. "I should get back," she said, standing and brushing dirt from her black dress. "Thank you for not making me feel foolish." "Nothing foolish about grief, Mrs. Hartwell. It's what we do with it that matters." As Margaret walked back toward town, she could feel Benjamin's eyes on her, but not in a way that made her uncomfortable. More like he was seeing something in her that she'd forgotten was there. At the edge of the cemetery, she turned back to look at him. He was still standing by James's grave, his hat in his hands, and she realized he was paying his own respects to a man he'd never met. The simple gesture touched something deep in her heart that had been frozen since the day James died. For the first time in months, Margaret Hartwell allowed herself to wonder if there might be more to life than just surviving from one day to the next. The next morning brought unexpected chaos to Willow Creek's main street. Margaret had barely stepped out of Henderson's general store when she heard shouting coming from the direction of the saloon. A crowd was gathering around 2 men who seemed ready to fight, and she could see Benjamin Cole standing in the middle of it all. "You calling me a liar, cowboy?" The angry voice belonged to Dutch Morrison, the biggest troublemaker in 3 counties. He was twice Benjamin's size and mean as a rattlesnake when he'd been drinking. "I'm saying you took money from that farmer for cattle you never delivered," Benjamin replied calmly, his hands loose at his sides. That makes you a thief, not a liar. Margaret's heart pounded as she watched the confrontation unfold. Dutch Morrison had a reputation for settling arguments with his fists, and he wasn't the type to fight fair. But Benjamin didn't look scared, just tired, like he'd seen this kind of thing too many times before. Nobody talks to me like that, Dutch snarled, stepping closer. Especially not some drifter who thinks he can come into our town and tell us how to do business. Your town. Benjamin's voice stayed level, but Margaret caught the steel underneath. Funny, I don't see your name on any deeds, and I don't see anyone else stepping up to help old Mr. Peterson get his money back. The crowd murmured at this. Everyone knew Dutch had cheated the elderly farmer, but no one had been brave enough to call him out on it. Margaret found herself moving closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. You want to settle this like men? Dutch asked, already rolling up his sleeves. I'd rather settle it like civilized people, Benjamin replied. You give Peterson his money back, and we'll call it even. Dutch's laugh was ugly. The only thing you're getting is a beating, Cowboy. He swung his massive fist toward Benjamin's face, but the cowboy was ready. He ducked smoothly to the side, letting Dutch's momentum carry him forward, then grabbed the bigger man's arm and used it to flip him onto his back in the dusty street. The crowd gasped as Dutch hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. Benjamin stood over him, not even breathing hard. Like I said, give Peterson his money back. This doesn't have to get ugly. But Dutch wasn't finished. He rolled to his feet and charged again, this time pulling a knife from his boot. Margaret screamed a warning, but Benjamin had already seen the blade. He grabbed Dutch's wrist and twisted until the knife fell, then delivered a punch to the big man's stomach that dropped him to his knees. Enough! Sheriff Williams pushed through the crowd, his hand on his gun. What's going on here? This stranger attacked me. Dutch wheezed, still trying to catch his breath. That's not what I saw, called out a voice from the crowd. Margaret was surprised to realize it was her own. Dutch pulled a knife on Mr. Cole after Mr. Cole asked him to pay back the money he owes Mr. Peterson. Several other people nodded in agreement, and Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction at the look of shock on Dutch's face. He clearly hadn't expected anyone to stand up to him, especially not a woman. Sheriff Williams looked between the two men, then at the crowd. Dutch, you've been causing trouble in this town for months. Time you learned some consequences. You've got until sunset to pay Peterson what you owe him, or you'll spend the night in jail. As the crowd began to break up, Margaret found herself walking beside Benjamin, who was dusting off his shirt. That was brave of you, she said quietly. Most people are too scared of Dutch to stand up to him. Fear's a choice, Benjamin replied. So is doing what's right. He looked at her with those kind eyes. Thank you for speaking up. That was brave too. Margaret felt her cheeks warm. I just told the truth. In my experience, that's often the bravest thing a person can do. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment before Benjamin spoke again. Mrs. Hartwell, I hope you don't mind me asking, but what are your plans now that... Well, now that you're on your own? The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd been trying not to think about her future, focusing instead on just getting through each day. But her savings were nearly gone, and no one in town would hire a woman, especially one they considered unsuitable. I'm not sure, she admitted. I suppose I'll have to leave Willow Creek soon. Maybe find work as a seamstress in a bigger town. Benjamin stopped walking and turned to face her. What if you didn't have to leave? What if there was another way? Margaret looked into his eyes and saw something there that made her pulse quicken. Whatever Benjamin Cole was about to suggest, she had the feeling it would change everything. Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched the letter that would change her life forever. The paper had arrived that morning with news that made her stomach drop like a stone into deep water. James's brother in Denver was claiming ownership of their cabin and everything in it, saying a woman had no right to property that belonged to the Hartwell family name. She sat on the porch steps, reading the cruel words over and over. James never should have married beneath his station, the letter said. Now that he's gone, it's time for his belongings to return to his rightful family. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up. Benjamin Cole was riding toward her cabin, leading a second horse behind him. His face brightened when he saw her, but the smile faded quickly when he noticed her tears. "What's wrong?" he asked, jumping down from his horse and hurrying to her side. Margaret handed him the letter without speaking. She watched his expression grow darker as he read, his jaw tightening with each line. "This is nonsense," he said firmly. "You were James's wife. The law says this property belongs to you. The law maybe, but not his family." Margaret's voice came out small and broken. "They have money for lawyers. I have nothing but grief and a handful of coins." Benjamin folded the letter carefully and sat beside her on the steps. "What if I told you that you have more than you think? What if I said there was a way to keep not just this cabin, but to build something bigger?" Margaret looked at him through her tears. "What do you mean?" "Yesterday, when I asked about your plans, I was leading up to something important." Benjamin turned to face her fully. "I've been saving money for years, working cattle drives and doing odd jobs. I've got enough to buy land north of here, good grazing land with water rights. But I need a partner." "A partner?" Margaret's heart began to beat faster. "Someone who knows how to keep books, someone who understands animals, someone who's not afraid of hard work." His eyes were serious and hopeful at the same time. "I've watched you with that old dog that hangs around town. You've got gentle hands and a patient heart. Those are gifts worth more than gold when it comes to training horses." Margaret stared at him in amazement. "You want me to help you start a horse ranch? I want you to be my business partner. Equal shares, equal say in how things are run." Benjamin pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "This is a contract I had the lawyer in town draw up. It's all legal and proper." The idea hit Margaret like lightning on a clear day. She could almost see it. Rolling green pastures, horses running free, a life built on something real instead of just memories of what used to be. "But what would people say?" she asked, though her heart was already racing with possibilities. "People will always find something to say. The question is whether you're going to let their words decide your future." Before Margaret could answer, the sound of multiple horses approaching made them both turn. Mrs. Whitmore was riding up the path with 3 other women from the church, their faces set like stone masks. "Margaret Hartwell," Mrs. Whitmore called out before she'd even dismounted. "We need to discuss your recent behavior." Margaret felt her new hope begin to crumble. These women had power in Willow Creek, and she knew they could make her life miserable if they chose to. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, standing slowly, "what brings you out here? Don't play innocent with me, young lady. The whole town is talking about how you've been carrying on with this drifter." She pointed an accusing finger at Benjamin. "It's shameful. Your husband isn't even cold in his grave." "James has been gone for 3 months, Margaret said quietly. 3 months isn't nearly long enough for proper mourning. And now we hear you're planning to go into business with this man. Alone. Unmarried. Do you have any idea what that looks like?" Benjamin started to speak, but Margaret held up her hand. Something was building inside her, something that felt like a dam about to burst. "What it looks like," Margaret said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "is a woman choosing to live instead of just exist. What it looks like is someone deciding to build something good instead of sitting around waiting for other people's approval." Mrs. Whitmore's face turned red with anger. "You're making a terrible mistake, Margaret. No decent person will associate with you if you continue down this path." Margaret looked at the contract still clutched in Benjamin's hand, then at the letter from James's brother, and finally at the 4 women who thought they had the right to control her life. "Then I suppose," she said with a calmness that surprised even her, "I'll have to find some indecent people to associate with." The shocked gasps from the church ladies were still echoing in the air when Margaret reached out and took the contract from Benjamin's hand. But before she could sign it, Mrs. Whitmore played her final card. "Sign that paper, Margaret Hartwell, and you'll never be welcome in this town again." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be put out. Margaret stared at the contract in her hands while Mrs. Whitmore and her companions waited for her to back down like she always had before. But something had changed in the past few minutes, something that felt like steel forming in her backbone. If this town can't welcome a woman who chooses to work for an honest living, Margaret said slowly, then maybe it's not the kind of place I want to be welcome in. She signed her name at the bottom of the contract with bold, clear letters. Mrs. Whitmore's face went white, then red, then purple. You'll regret this decision, Margaret. Mark my words. The only thing I regret, Margaret replied, is waiting so long to make it. After the church ladies rode away in a cloud of dust and anger, Benjamin turned to Margaret with amazement written all over his face. I've never seen anything like that, he said. You just stood up to the most powerful women in Willow Creek. Margaret felt dizzy with what she'd done. I think I might be sick, she admitted. That's normal, Benjamin laughed. First time you choose freedom over safety, it hits you like a punch to the stomach. But it gets easier. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret learned just how hard freedom could be. Word of her decision spread through town faster than wildfire. The grocer stopped giving her credit. The seamstress refused to sell her thread. Even the preacher crossed the street to avoid speaking to her after Sunday service. But Benjamin kept his word about being a true partner. Every morning, he arrived at her cabin with supplies and plans for their future ranch. They spent hours going over maps, discussing which breeds of horses would sell best, planning where to build the barn and house. We'll call it Healing Ground Ranch, Benjamin suggested one afternoon as they sat on her porch, sketching ideas in the dirt. For horses that need a second chance, just like us. Margaret liked the sound of that. How do you know so much about training difficult horses? Benjamin's expression grew serious. My pa died when I was 12. Got sent to live with my uncle, who ran a small ranch outside San Antonio. He specialized in taking horses that other people had given up on, animals that had been beaten or neglected or just plain scared of humans. That must have been hard work. The hardest, but also the most rewarding. When you finally gain the trust of a horse that's been hurt, when you see that light come back into its eyes. Benjamin shook his head in wonder. It's like watching something dead come back to life. Margaret understood exactly what he meant. She'd been feeling dead inside since James passed. But working with Benjamin on their plans was awakening parts of her she'd thought were gone forever. There's something else we need to discuss, Benjamin said, his tone becoming more serious. Building this ranch is going to take every penny I've saved, plus whatever money you can contribute. We'll be living simple for the first few years, probably in a one-room cabin while we get established. I'm not afraid of simple living, Margaret assured him. I know that, but there's another issue. Benjamin looked uncomfortable. People are already talking about us working together. Once we move out to the ranch alone, those rumors are going to get worse. Margaret had been trying not to think about this problem. In 1867, an unmarried man and woman living on the same property would be scandalous, even if they were business partners. What are you suggesting? She asked. I'm suggesting we might need to consider making this partnership more than just business, Benjamin said carefully. I'm not talking about love or romance. I'm talking about a practical arrangement that would protect both our reputations and our investment. The idea hit Margaret like cold water. Marriage of convenience wasn't uncommon on the frontier, but the thought of marrying someone other than James felt like betraying his memory. I need time to think about this, she said. Of course, it's a big decision. That night, alone in her cabin, Margaret found herself talking to James's photograph on the mantel. I don't know what to do, she whispered. I never thought I'd have to make choices like this without you. The wind rattled the windows, and for a moment, Margaret could almost hear James's voice telling her to follow her heart and trust her judgment. The next morning brought news that would force her decision faster than she'd planned. Mrs. Whitmore arrived at Margaret's door with Sheriff Williams and a piece of paper that made Margaret's blood run cold. Margaret Hartwell, the sheriff said uncomfortably. I'm sorry to have to do this, but Mrs. Whitmore has filed a complaint claiming you're running an improper house. Town council voted to investigate. Margaret stared at the official-looking document. An improper house? What does that mean? Mrs. Whitmore smiled coldly. It means we have the right to inspect your property and question your activities. And if we find evidence of inappropriate behavior, we can force you to leave town. The trap was closing around Margaret faster than she'd expected, but as she looked at the smug faces of her accusers, she realized something important. She wasn't the same frightened widow they thought they were dealing with anymore. The courthouse clock struck 9 as Margaret walked through Willow Creek's main street, her chin high despite the whispers that followed her like shadows. Today was the day Mrs. Whitmore's investigation would decide her fate. But Margaret had spent the sleepless night before making a decision that would shock everyone in town. "You don't have to do this," Benjamin said quietly, walking beside her. "We could just leave now, start over somewhere else." "Running away won't solve anything," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "If I don't stand up for myself here, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I'm brave enough to fight for what matters." The town hall was packed with curious faces, some supportive but most hungry for scandal. Mrs. Whitmore sat at the front with the town council, a stack of papers in front of her that Margaret knew contained lies and twisted truths designed to destroy her reputation forever. Judge Harrison, a fair man despite his advanced age, called the meeting to order. "We're here to investigate claims that Mrs. Margaret Hartwell has been conducting herself in a manner unsuitable for a respectable widow." Mrs. Whitmore stood immediately, her voice ringing with false righteousness. "Your Honor, this woman has been entertaining a strange man at her home at all hours, conducting private business meetings without proper supervision, and making plans to live alone with him in the wilderness. Such behavior brings shame to our entire community." A murmur ran through the crowd. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had prepared for this moment. "Mrs. Whitmore," Judge Harrison said patiently, "do you have proof of any wrongdoing beyond normal business activities?" "Business activities?" Mrs. Whitmore's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "What business does a grieving widow have with a drifter? I have witnesses who saw them sitting together on her porch, talking in low voices, sharing meals." "Sharing meals is hardly criminal," the judge observed. But Mrs. Whitmore wasn't finished. She pulled out her strongest weapon, a letter she'd somehow obtained from James's brother in Denver. "Furthermore, Your Honor, the deceased husband's family has requested that this woman be removed from property that rightfully belongs to them. They claim she has no legal right to the Hartwell name or holdings." The courtroom erupted in surprised chatter. Margaret felt the walls closing in around her, but then Benjamin stood up from his seat in the back. "Your Honor, if I may speak?" Judge Harrison nodded. "The court recognizes Mr. Benjamin Cole." Benjamin walked to the front of the room, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "I'd like to address these charges directly. Mrs. Whitmore is correct that Mrs. Hartwell and I have been conducting business together. We've been planning to start a horse ranch as equal partners." "Equal partners?" Mrs. Whitmore scoffed. "How convenient. And I suppose you expect us to believe this arrangement is purely professional." "No," Benjamin said quietly. "I don't." The word hit the courtroom like thunder. Margaret's heart stopped beating for a moment as every eye turned toward Benjamin. "The truth is," Benjamin continued, "I asked Mrs. Hartwell to marry me 3 days ago, and yesterday, she accepted." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Margaret stared at Benjamin in shock. This wasn't part of any plan they'd discussed. Mrs. Whitmore's face went purple with rage, while Judge Harrison banged his gavel repeatedly for order. "You're lying," Mrs. Whitmore shrieked. "This is a desperate attempt to save her reputation." Benjamin reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Judge Harrison, would you examine this engagement ring and the receipt showing when I purchased it in Billings 2 weeks ago?" As the judge studied the evidence, Margaret's mind raced. Benjamin had never mentioned buying a ring, never proposed in the way he was claiming. But as their eyes met across the crowded room, she saw something there that made her pulse quicken, not deception, but truth. Somehow, without either of them saying it directly, they had both realized that their partnership had grown into something deeper. "The receipt appears genuine," Judge Harrison announced. "Mr. Cole, when do you plan to marry?" "As soon as possible, Your Honor. We've already spoken with Reverend Murphy about performing the ceremony next Sunday." This was news to Margaret, but she found herself nodding in agreement. That's correct, Your Honor. Mrs. Whitmore looked like she'd been slapped. This is ridiculous. They're making this up to avoid scandal. Perhaps, Judge Harrison said thoughtfully. But if they are legally married, then all these accusations become meaningless. A woman has every right to conduct business with her husband. What about the property claim? Mrs. Whitmore demanded desperately. Judge Harrison consulted his law books. According to territorial law, a widow's right to her deceased husband's property cannot be challenged by extended family members, especially if she remarries and establishes a new household. The Hartwell brothers have no legal standing. The victory should have felt sweet, but Margaret found herself focused on something else entirely. As Benjamin walked back toward her through the crowd, she realized that somewhere between signing that partnership contract and standing up to Mrs. Whitmore, her feelings for him had changed from gratitude to something much deeper. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered when he reached her side. "Yes, I did," he replied softly. "I've been wanting to ask you properly for weeks. This just gave me the courage to finally do it. But what if I'd said no in front of everyone?" Benjamin smiled, and Margaret saw love shining in his eyes. Real love, not just practical arrangement. "Then I would have respected your decision and found another way to protect you. But I was hoping you'd say yes." As they walked out of the courthouse together, hand in hand, Margaret heard Mrs. Whitmore making one last desperate attempt to save face. "This isn't over," she called after them. "I'll find a way to prove this marriage is a sham." But Margaret no longer cared about Mrs. Whitmore's threats. She had Benjamin's ring on her finger, a new life waiting for her, and the knowledge that she had found the strength to fight for her own happiness. The real test, however, would come in the next few days. Planning a wedding in less than a week while dealing with the aftermath of the courthouse drama would challenge both of them in ways they hadn't expected. And Margaret still hadn't told Benjamin about the letter she'd received that morning, the one from James's brother threatening to come to Montana personally to contest their marriage and reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. Snow began falling on the morning of Margaret and Benjamin's wedding, coating Willow Creek in white that made everything look fresh and new. Margaret stood in front of her small mirror, adjusting the simple blue dress that had been her mother's, trying to calm the butterflies dancing in her stomach. A knock at her door interrupted her nervous preparations. She opened it to find old Mrs. Peterson, the farmer's wife whose husband Benjamin had helped when Dutch Morrison cheated him. "My dear," Mrs. Peterson said warmly, holding out a small bouquet of winter roses. "I know these flowers aren't much in this weather, but I wanted you to have something beautiful for your special day." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. After weeks of being shunned by most of the town, this simple kindness meant everything. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know how much this means to me." "Oh, but I do," Mrs. Peterson replied. "I was young once, and I remember what it felt like to be judged by people who didn't know the first thing about my heart." As Margaret prepared to leave for the church, she found a small crowd gathered outside her cabin. To her amazement, it included several people she'd never expected to see. The blacksmith who'd always been kind, the doctor who'd cared for James during his final illness, and even some of the younger women from town who had watched her courthouse victory with admiration. "We wanted to walk with you to the church," explained Sarah Mitchell, a young mother who'd recently moved to Willow Creek. "If that's all right with you." Margaret felt her heart swell with gratitude. "It's more than all right. It's perfect." The small procession made its way through the snow-covered streets, growing larger as more supporters joined them. By the time they reached the church, Margaret was surrounded by nearly 30 people who had chosen to stand with her against the town's judgment. But as they approached the church steps, Margaret's happiness was shattered by a sight that made her blood run cold. An expensive black carriage sat outside the building, and climbing down from it was a man she recognized from a photograph James had shown her, his older brother Robert, accompanied by two other stern-faced men in city clothes. "Margaret!" Robert Hartwell called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I've come to stop this ridiculous charade." The crowd around Margaret fell silent, sensing the tension. Benjamin appeared in the church doorway, his face grim as he took in the scene. "Mr. Hartwell," Margaret said, forcing her voice to remain steady. What brings you to Montana? Don't play innocent with me, Robert snapped. I know what you're trying to do. Marry this drifter to strengthen your claim on my brother's property. Well, I have news for you. I've brought a lawyer, and we're prepared to challenge this marriage in territorial court. One of the men beside Robert stepped forward. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm Attorney Williams from Denver. We have evidence that this marriage is a business arrangement designed to circumvent inheritance laws. Such unions can be declared invalid under territorial statute. Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. After everything she'd been through, after finding the courage to fight for her happiness, it seemed like it might all be taken away by legal technicalities. But then Benjamin stepped down from the church and placed himself between Margaret and the men from Denver. You're welcome to challenge our marriage in court, he said calmly. But you'll have to wait until after we're legally wed. And I should warn you, we have our own lawyer and our own evidence. What evidence? Robert demanded. Benjamin reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. Letters from James to Margaret, written during their courtship and marriage. Letters that clearly state his wish that she should find happiness again if anything happened to him. Letters that specifically mention his desire for her to keep their property and build a new life. Margaret stared at Benjamin in shock. How did you get those? You left them on your kitchen table the day we signed our partnership agreement, Benjamin explained gently. I couldn't help but see the top one, where James wrote about wanting you to remarry someone who would treat you with the love and respect you deserved. I figured they might come in handy someday. Robert's lawyer took the letters and examined them quickly, his confident expression fading with each page he read. These appear to be genuine, he admitted reluctantly. If they are, they significantly strengthen Mrs. Hartwell's position. They're genuine, Margaret said firmly. James always worried about what would happen to me if he died young. He made me promise not to waste my life grieving forever. Robert's face was red with anger and embarrassment. This is preposterous. You can't overturn family inheritance rights with a few romantic letters. Actually, came a new voice from the crowd. In territorial law, a husband's written wishes regarding his property take precedence over family claims, especially when those wishes are clearly documented. Everyone turned to see Judge Harrison approaching, apparently drawn by the commotion. I took the liberty of researching this matter after yesterday's hearing. Mr. Hartwell, your brother's property legally belongs to his widow, and her remarriage only strengthens that ownership. The defeat on Robert's face was clear, but he made one last attempt to salvage his mission. Even if the property claim fails, this marriage is still a fraud. They barely know each other. We know each other well enough, Margaret said, stepping forward to take Benjamin's hand. We know that we both value honesty, hard work, and treating people with kindness. We know that we want to build something good together. And we know that we've fallen in love despite starting as business partners. The last part was true, Margaret realized as she said it. Somewhere between the courthouse and this moment, her gratitude and respect for Benjamin had blossomed into real love. Is that true, Mr. Cole? Judge Harrison asked. Benjamin looked into Margaret's eyes, and she saw her own feelings reflected there. It's true, Your Honor. I asked Margaret to marry me because I love her, not because of any business arrangement. Judge Harrison nodded with satisfaction. Then I see no legal impediment to this marriage. Reverend Murphy, are you ready to proceed? As Robert Hartwell and his companions retreated to their carriage in defeat, Margaret and Benjamin walked into the church hand in hand. The ceremony was simple but beautiful, surrounded by the people who had chosen to support them. When Reverend Murphy pronounced them husband and wife, Benjamin's kiss was gentle and full of promise. As they walked back down the aisle together, Margaret caught sight of Mrs. Whitmore sitting in the back pew, her face sour with disappointment. But Margaret no longer cared about Mrs. Whitmore's approval. She had found something far more valuable, a partner who saw her worth, a community that supported her choices, and the knowledge that she was strong enough to fight for her own happiness. Outside the church, as rice and flower petals fell around them like blessings, Benjamin leaned close to her ear. Are you ready to start building our ranch, Mrs. Cole? Margaret smiled up at her new husband, her heart full of joy and possibility. "I've been ready since the day I signed that contract. Let's go claim our territory." As they climbed into Benjamin's wagon to begin their journey to their new home, Margaret felt James's presence like a warm breeze, carrying his approval and love. She was finally free to live again, and she intended to make the most of every precious day.